Thanks, Josh. As Josh mentioned, I'm from Nova Scotia. Oh yeah, we got some Scotians in the crowd. I'm third generation Nova Scotian Dutch on my father's side, and sort of question mark generation Prince Edward Islander Acadian on my mom's side. And I grew up, I say sub-rural because either it's slightly more urban than the rural or slightly less. It was a very small forest-surrounded farming hamlet, legally a hamlet because it was too small to be a village, called Middle Musquodoboit by the people who live there. So named to distinguish it, of course, from the much more renowned Upper, Lower, and Central Musquodoboit. Hey, yeah, that worked. All of these places would be probably not best pronounced Musquodoboit, which is Mi'kmaq for foaming water. That's the name of the river that runs through the Musquodoboit or Musquodoboit Valley, and whose seasonal flooding makes the area such a great place for agriculture. I want to introduce myself in this way to say where I'm coming from, where the questions I'm going to ask are coming from, because places and their histories and the overlapping of places and times, that's so crucial to both Tanya Talaga's Seven Fallen Feathers and Liz Howard's Infinite Citizen of the Shaking Tent, which we'll be talking about a bit today. So I grew up, as most of us have, I think, in a place that erases and denies the places that are there as well. In fact, every place I've lived, every place in Nova Scotia I've lived, Wellington, New Zealand, Edmonton, Dublin, Ireland, Toronto, and now London, all of these places have been both an artifact of colonial erasure and like a painstakingly maintained infrastructure of keeping some stories in mind and some stories out of mind. So with that in mind, we're on land that has cared for and has been cared for by Attawandaron, Algonquin, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenni Lenape peoples. The Chippewa of the Thames Nation, the Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation now share this region with settlers from dozens and dozens, let's give it three figures, probably 100 different backgrounds in London. So, dank je, that's the Dutch I don't speak. Merci, that's the French I don't speak. And thank you, all of you, for being here today. I want to start by introducing Liz Howard. She was born and raised in Northern Ontario. She holds an Honours Bachelor of Science with high distinction from the University of Toronto. Liz's first book of poems, Infinite Citizen of the Shaking Tent, probably one of the best titled collections ever of poetry. It won the 2016 Griffin Poetry Prize, the first time a debut collection has won that prize. And if I can editorialize and probably fawn a little bit, I want to emphasize that marks or may mark, it's not quite certain yet, a pretty profound shift in Canadian poetry. The Griffin it's always been awarded for a book, but it's often seemed or been very obviously a kind of mid to late career lifetime achievement award. Some people who have won it for not their best work, that type of thing. So Liz's win is a little bit like an actor winning an Oscar for their very first role. And in a poetry ecosystem currently experiencing a really extreme publication bottleneck, there's a lot of great poetry being written in Canada, and there aren't enough collections coming out every year to keep up with that. With that bottleneck in mind, Liz's win has, I hoped, pushed Canadian publishers of poetry to take greater risks on emerging poets. So, and please let that be the case, because I don't yet have a book deal, so here's hoping. But to continue, okay. Stop editorializing. Liz's Infinite Citizen was also a finalist for the 2015 Governor General's Award for Poetry, and an honorable mention for the 2016 Alana Bondar Memorial Prize for the Environmental Humanities and Creative Writing. Liz's chapbook, Skullambulant, which came out with Furna House, and its contents comprise one of the sections of Infinite Citizen, that was shortlisted for the 2012 BP Nicol Chapbook Award. Liz's poetry has also appeared in Canadian literary journals like the Capital Annual Review, very hard to get into, the Puritan, a little bit easier to get into, but so lovely, and Matrix. I don't think I'll ever get into Matrix. She recently completed an MFA in creative writing through the University of Guelph and works as a research officer in cognitive psychology at the University of Toronto. Tanya Talaga lives in Toronto and has been a journalist at the Toronto Star for 20 years. She has been nominated 5 times for the Michener Award, which honors outstanding and unbiased public service journalism. She has twice won a National Newspaper Award for her work as part of a team. The first win was in 2013, and it was for her team's coverage it was a year-long project, right? Yeah, year-long project covering the collapse of the Rana Plaza building in Bangladesh. The Rana Plaza was a 5-story commercial building housing 5 different garment factories as well as a bunch of other businesses. And its collapse resulted in the death of over 1,100 people, the injury of over 2,500 more. And coverage of this disaster brought international attention to the dangerous working conditions that are sort of necessitated by our exploitative global supply chains. Tanya's second National Magazine Award as part of a team was in 2015, and it was for a series of stories on the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I don't think I need to say how important that is. Tanya's nonfiction book, 7 Fallen Feathers, Racism, Death, and Hard Truths in a Northern City, is currently a finalist for the 2017 Hillary Weston Writers' Trust Prize for Nonfiction, whose jury commends the vivid, wrenching book as lyrical and razor-sharp reporting and a searing critique of Canada's ongoing colonial legacy. So I want to start by asking Tanya if she would like to talk a bit about her book and do a reading, and then I'll ask Liz to read. Thanks.
Ani Buzu, thank you very much for having me here today in wet and rainy London. I wanted to start by giving you a little bit more of an introduction into myself. Thank you very much. That was really good, really thorough. But I need to back up a little bit more in order to tell you about 7 Fallen Feathers and why I decided to write this book. This book is as a result of, I like to say, many, many hands. I feel like there were so many voices that contributed to the writing of this book, and I'm going to introduce you to 2 of them that are on my mind at the moment as I read today. In 2011, I was a journalist. I still am a journalist. I'm on leave right now, but I was at the Toronto Star. I was a national reporter, and I was trying to figure out a way I could insert myself into the federal election campaign. I really wanted to cover what was happening with the national election. It was Stephen Harper versus Jack Layton. And I pitched to my editors, because I was sort of one of the low men on the totem pole, so to speak. And I pitched to my editors, I would really like to do a story on why it is Indigenous people aren't voting. I knew the reason why. I knew that Indigenous people in this country didn't have the right to vote until 1960. But I thought to myself, this is a story that isn't really on the radar of most Canadians. This is before Idle No More. This is before the TRC was out and everywhere and more on people's conscience, when more people were more attuned to Indigenous news like they are now. My editor said, okay, sure, why don't you go to Thunder Bay and do a feature story. I'd chosen Thunder Bay for a couple of reasons. One reason is I'm quite familiar with the area, and the second reason why is because that's where the Grand Chief of Anishinaabe Nation at the time, Stan Bairdy, was. And Stan was the Grand Chief of 49 Northern First Nations in a massive area of Northern Ontario that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So I went to interview Stan and asked him, why is it Indigenous people don't vote? So we sat down in his office. That was my first question. And as soon as I asked it, he looked at me and he said, why aren't you writing a story about Jordan Wabas? And I thought, oh, well, maybe he's not hearing what I'm saying. So then I started again, and I said, repeated my question, and he looked at me and he goes, Jordan's been missing for 70 days. So then I thought, okay, well, I'm not getting what I want, let's try one more question. So I asked, surely if you can get some of the nations in certain areas to sort of act as a swing vote, you could perhaps turn a riding or two with this election. And then he looked at me and he said to me that Jordan is the 7th student to go missing or to die in Thunder Bay since 2000. And when he said that to me, my ears opened up and I finally listened to what he was saying. And I put away that manic Toronto journalist part of myself to the side. And I sat there and I listened to him. And I listened to him speak to me and tell me what he wanted to say. Needless to say, I never did file that story on the election, and that's it's always an interesting thing, because when you pitch a story to your editors, you should come home with it, especially when you're spending money to go do something like that. But instead, I came home with another story. I came home with a story on the 7. At that time, Jordan was still missing, but within a month and a half of me leaving Thunder Bay and publishing that story, Jordan's body would be found in one of the rivers outside of or inside Thunder Bay. So that's how I came to the story. I began to write news articles for the Star. I was at Queen's Park, so I had the lucky chance of nabbing all the politicians as they came out of question period. So I would bug whoever was the Attorney General, I'd bug the Premier, and I'd ask, why are you not doing an inquest into the deaths of these 7 kids? One of the things I couldn't understand is why this wasn't making national news. If there were 7 kids missing in Toronto or London or Ottawa, that would be all over the national news and every single paper, and there would be commissions, inquiries, but not in Thunder Bay. And this book deals with the fact that it's not just about Thunder Bay. It's an important thing to know. This book is a story of Canada. This is a story of Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations. It's a story of broken treaties. It's a story of the residential school system and what has been left behind, intergenerational trauma. And at the heart, too, this is a story of love. This is a story of 7 children who lost their lives because they were forced to go from their homes, leave their homes, and go to high school 500, 600 kilometers away from where they live. Why they have to do that is because there are no proper high schools for them to attend in their home communities. So these kids, when they're 14, some are 13, some are 15, they leave home, they leave their families, and they move to a southern city. Thunder Bay happens to be one of them because it's sort of on the, it's a feeder city, really. There's also Sioux Lookout to the Manitoba border. They also take students. And it's important to know, too, that these kids are coming, they're coming from places where their first language isn't English. Oftentimes it's Ojibwe, it's Ojibwe. They leave where they're living, they leave their families, they leave everything they know. They are also leaving communities where there are no malls, there are no traffic lights, there are no stores other than the Northern store, which is this one sort of catch-all store that sells rubber boots and ham, everything you could possibly imagine. So they're leaving that and they're coming to the big city, Thunder Bay, and they're by themselves. It's there's lots of questions about that, and there's lots of ways to make that better. The book talks about a lot of that, so I won't go on about it at the moment, anyway. But I'm going to start with my reading, and I'm going to start with Alvin Fiddler. And why I'm starting with him is Alvin Fiddler is now the Grand Chief of Anishinaabe Nation. Once Stan left, Alvin became Grand Chief. And this is a conversation, this reading is a conversation between him and I, and it happened about a year and a half ago. I was about to tell him that I'm going to write this book. This tells you a little bit more about myself and why I wrote it, and also about Alvin and the situation in Thunder Bay. This chapter as well, it's called Why Chani Ran. And I'm going to finish with a little reading on Chani Wenjack. The sleek black office towers and luxury hotels that line the Air Canada Centre are the height of modernity in the city of Toronto. This is where multicultural Raptors fans squeeze into the fan zone and jump up and down when the network cameras pan over them as legendary Maple Leafs players with frozen bronze smiles silently watch over. At the Real Sports Bar and Grill, waitresses in tight black t-shirts sell mojitos and Bud Light to badly behaved men on weekend sports getaways with their buddies. Walk up the street and you can climb the CN Tower, catch a Jays game, or join the crowds at the aquarium and marvel at stingrays and swordfish as they swim above your head. Inside the Delta Hotel in an empty coffee bar, Alvin Fiddler scans the list of herbal teas above the bored-looking cashier's head. Mint. He'll have the mint. The cashier has no idea she's just served tea to the Grand Chief of Anishinaabe Nation, who, after Stan Bairdi left, won the support of chiefs encompassing an area roughly the size of France. A man who 2 centuries ago would have commanded the respect of the servants of the crown as they conspired to carve up the land she is now standing on. Fiddler looks out of place as he settles down at a small circular table, electric pop tinning out of the cafe's speakers. Small and powerfully built, Fiddler crosses his arms and his legs, almost as if he's trying to contain his own energy. He's looking at me with his "what's this all about" face. It's Easter weekend, and Fiddler has characteristically jammed a number of appointments into 3 days: a romantic weekend with his wife Tisa, a Prince concert, a fetal alcohol syndrome conference, the signing of a new treaty between the Cree communities of James Bay Coast and the province of Ontario, and shopping for vinyl on Queen Street. This weekend is a brief respite from his responsibilities of overseeing the governance of 45,000 people stretched over the immense northern half of the province of Ontario. Most of his Anishinaabe people don't have access to clean water, they can't flush their toilets, and many have to haul their shit in pails to dump it out in the bush. His youth are experiencing the highest suicide rate in the Western world, and he can't stop them from killing themselves. And God, he has tried. He arranges baseball clinic weekends, athletic tournaments, and galas and hotel ballrooms to showcase teen talent. This past spring, Fiddler convinced Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to let a group of teens travel to Parliament Hill to meet Trudeau in Ottawa, so they could tell Canada's Hollywood handsome and born of privilege Prime Minister about their lives. Trudeau is sympathetic, but Fiddler knows that he will never truly grasp the enormity of the issues his people live through every single day. History dictates that to be so. Fiddler runs his hands through his black spiky hair and he fixes his gaze on me. "How is Wraith?" he asks with a laugh. Wraith is a forgotten stop in the bush along the old Canadian Pacific Railway line, about an hour west of Thunder Bay. The town used to be a small settlement of trappers and laborers who lived off the land. There was a well for fresh water because there wasn't any plumbing. A small one-room schoolhouse and a store once stood in the area. Now it is nothing but a handful of run-down houses by the road. Only the Anishinaabe know where Wraith is. Ask any white person in Thunder Bay if they've heard of Wraith and they'll screw up their face and look at you as if it sounds kind of familiar, but they can't quite place it. Ask an Indigenous person, and well, it's a different story. They'll tell you exactly how far it is down the highway, how long it will take you to get there, and who they used to know there or in Savan, Uppsala, or any points in between. Wraith is where my mother spent much of her girlhood, raised by her maternal grandparents, Liz Gauthier, a residential school survivor, and Russell Bowen, a.k.a. Alphonse Piskey, a trapper and rail worker who was spared from residential school because he was kept hidden from the Indian agents in the bush. Liz and Russ married in Savan, moved to Graham, and eventually settled in Wraith. When I first told Fiddler my mom was from Wraith, he couldn't quite believe it. An urban journalist with roots in Wraith? He was fall off your chair astounded. I tell Fiddler that I'm starting to write a book about the 7 students who died while at school in Thunder Bay, and that I was troubled that 5 of those teens died in the water surrounding Fort William First Nation. He nods. I tell him that I have wanted to write this book for 5 years since I stood in a former Canadian Red Cross office that had turned into the command center in the search for Jordan. At the time, he had been missing for 70 days. Alvin, a former deputy chief of Muskrat Dam First Nation, was away traveling with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when Tisa called to tell him that Jordan was gone. The TRC is the Government of Canada's most important attempt to heal the wounds of the past with its 150,000 Indigenous people and their hundreds of thousands of descendants whose lives were inextricably altered by the residential school system. In 2011, the TRC was traveling across the country collecting stories of the survivors. Fiddler coordinated regional meetings, and he oversaw the testimony of all survivors in Ontario. He saw firsthand the devastation of intergenerational trauma in Canada's north. He learned about children dying of preventable illness, of how poor nutrition and uncared for diabetes could ruin the body and the mind. And he became intimately acquainted with suicide epidemics where children as young as 10 were killing themselves. He learned about the legacy of sexual abuse and the ravages of the residential school system. What he saw as Grand Chief of Nan, what he lived in his own communities, drove him to devote his life to making life better for his people. Fiddler remembers where he was when Tisa called him again, this time to tell him that Jordan's body had been discovered in the river. He was in Yellowknife, in another hotel. We had been listening to endless streams of testimony on behalf of the TRC. It had been an emotional day. Each residential school survivor had a witness in the room and an elder or a health advocate to make sure the survivor received psychological and emotional support. Listening to those stories was both a great honor and a tremendous responsibility. It was also emotionally draining. Some days the pain was unbearable and his head would pound with the weight of remembrance. Alvin had ducked out into the hallway to take Tisa's call. Tisa told him they had found Jordan in the river. Alvin started to seethe. He had told them. He had warned them. He had warned everyone 3 years ago in 2008 after another student, Reggie Bushy, was found dead in the water. When he was deputy chief of Nan, he cautioned that the children were dying at school in Thunder Bay and something had to be done to stop it. I tell Fiddler I didn't write the book back then because life got in the way. Fiddler nods. You weren't meant to do this book before. You are now. Then he offers some advice. You need to start with Chani Wenjack. I go blank and I feel ashamed for not knowing who Chani Wenjack is. He isn't one of the 7 dead students. Fiddler sees I've never heard his name. He leans forward across the table from me and he says, Chani Wenjack. The book starts with Chani. It's important that it starts with Chani, and you probably all know the story of him, but he passed 51 years ago. The 51st anniversary of his death was actually just October 22nd. There was an inquest into his death. There were only 4 recommendations. The inquest was held a month after he died. No one from his family was invited. They did not have standing. They didn't even know about it until they read about it in a Maclean's article that was published later on. One of the recommendations was more of a question, and that recommendation asked, why is it we're still doing this in 1966? Why are we sending children so far away from their homes to live in a residential school, away from their culture and their language and their families to learn? It is now 2017, and we are still doing the same thing. That's why the book starts with Chani. And I was going to do a reading, but I see that I'm taking longer than my 15 minutes. Another one. So you'll just have to read the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Liz, do you want to just take it away? Thanks.
Hello, thank you, Andy, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Tanya. It's a real honor to be reading and speaking with you today. And thank you all for coming. I'm not so large on preparatory remarks, but I'll just say it may be helpful to know that I grew up in a really small town in northern Ontario called Chapleau in Treaty 9 territory. A lot of my work deals with that childhood process of growing up and then moving to Toronto to attend university. This is Terra Nova Terraformed. Spent shale, thigh haptic fissure, row, river, delta of sleep-inducing peptides abet our tent. In a deep time course, in Venus retrograde, we coalesced into the Cartesian floral pattern of heritage, where I hunt along a creek as you pack bits of bone away within a system of conservation. The site was discovered during construction of a new Venice highway for stars, birthing themselves out of pyroclastic dust and telepathy in the time zone of some desperate hour when all our exits are terraformed. Sons and daughters of the liberal arts, all my life has spurned a desire for more than a power line of injured transistors. Fetal alcohol syndrome, oil drum sunk to the bottom of every lake. The aurora borealis, an overdose along the magnetized pole. What we are offered in lieu of a soul, another paper cut of lambent plasma, thickening the wound bed of release. Oak Creek, Bleeding Hills, census, inveterate, let me sleep 5 more minutes, just 5 minutes more, before we default on eternity. Lookbook. Over there on the green lawn under a sick pine is the body of the bird. His plumage blue when I go to look at him and wonder if he's dead. His chest sort of heaves, so I bend down closer. Look how the breast of the bird splits open, and a fist of maggots spills out on the grass. A necklace of sticky pearls and peristalsis ribbed and shining in the July light. Invertebrates that form an anecdote before I go back into our clapboard house to look at the Sears catalog and dream I am a girl posed into happiness. Look at me here now in this new dress I've bought with my own money at age 20 in the city. When the cops question me, I flash my passport, thinking of lichen inching down a branch of a tree over the town river when I was small. And somewhere my birth father is drunk and homeless, half mad when the cops ask for his name, he'll say December. Boreal swing. My mother hunted moose. As a child, my grandfather taught her how to field dress a bull. Make an incision from the throat to the pelvis, the abdominal cavity emptied. Haul him up between 2 pines, the body inverted, antlers almost grazing the soil. Each hind limb leashed to a trunk above to allow the flesh to cool. Then she'd climb inside the open chest, fix her toes along the ledge of 2 ribs, and with a kick to the bull's left shoulder, he sent her swinging. 1992. This is our welfare. Half a duplex with mint green siding shrugged between rail yard and Main Street. Logging trucks and trains shake the foundation so much I mistake them for God. Forever it is winter. Mom dissolves into smoke, into mentholated smoke and coffee mate at the kitchen table, painting orcas and nor'easters in burnt umber and verdigris until the fuel we burn for heat dissipates. I find my brother sitting blue-tinged in his crib, mucus freezing to his tiny upper lip. Come spring, he gets up on 2 feet to press his left hand onto her canvas, leaves his mark in the sky, just over where a suggestion of light snuck out through the rippled storm cloud, a copper coin shining onto where the waters calm at a distance from the anonymous shore. I'm going to read this next poem that contains the title of the collection within it. It's called Think Tent, and it begins with a quote, epigraph from the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. I am my world, the microcosm. Hospitality, the first demand. What is your name? The city bound me, so I entered, to dream a science that would name me daughter, and launch beyond grief the old thoracic cause. Myocardium, a blood orange foundry handed down by the humoral anatomists, and to not be inside my own head perpetually, not simply Wittgenstein's girl, but an infinite citizen in a shaking tent. If you are in need of an answer, consult Ajisaki Wanini, scientific rigor, psychoanalysis, the unconscious, a construct, method, amphibious, of two minds. That's the translator, her task to receive the call that comes down the barrel of the future. All of us a congress of selves, a vibrational chorus. I know myself to be a guest in your mind, a grand lodge of everything I long to know and hold within this potlatch we call the present moment. If I speak of the night, speak its illicit cerebrum of branches and back seats, speak beyond our future, a thinkable urn, my empirical training, my non-status brow ridge, indivisible and glistening, every time I tease a thread of being from its moment in standard time. Let's elevate the coordinates of distress. Take it all in, I'm all in and over the limit, the eliminative, the lumens, the mens rea, the loom, to be a shopkeep in the showroom of nouns, what to purchase and what to disavow. Speak with saffron, speak of just the small bits, atomic, speak of the inevitable curve in the data, all foreclosed upon and glimmering like a good bitch in the brine of night. I haven't nearly enough heat here in this stakeout. The sky died and I'm its anima in the pitch thickets. I have fingers with which to squish pin cherries and rose hips. Dogwood, I have begun to hear a rosary of pure tones, the colony. Hear its call toward disorder. Citizens, I have never been dishonest in my horror. The underclass of our era, a requisite paternity test. Dominus in excelsis. Our foisted self-addendum was called against our lack of surprise. Everything that always happens as it happens to you. In the soiled ledger of our days, I know you know. We are forever evident. In our swampy coda of tending the land is its own belonging to itself. In a laboratory of thought, lifting paper cups of black foam up to our mouths. Without cameras, everything becomes the fringe of our interior. Affect is an aid to cognition, shameless in its missionary position of standard time. Another day, unmoored from its twin, hysterical about music, our ontogeny, an iterative gasket. I knew it as a sphere flinched in my portal vein, thickening and bleating and posturing. All that happened upon the digital. Sidestep the distinction, bless it, unfettered, the open stone's face. It was as if we almost knew, but then the scene changed. A false shore above the original. And I'll read a poem that's among the earliest written in the collection. And it's very much this push and pull between story and experiment and rural and urban. In the beginning, it recounts the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe migration story from the East Coast along the St. Lawrence to the Great Lakes region. So that's just what that's referencing. This is called Psychogeography. From New Brunswick to Sault Ste. Marie, Boating, and Northwest, I came into being with jackpine thieves and the heronry. Like Nanabosho, I lost my vision to a covenant of ducks in vertigo, whipped a birch to mark my name. South of the fortune cookie factory, on the street where I lived, I lost the nerve to speak.
Stereotaxic, I had the stomach of an ox, ruminative pulse. It's always one and the same thing. Just north of here, down in the ravine, a friend saw a man burying another in the earth before dawn. One midnight, I rose to guide my hand over the hide of a black bear hit by a blue pickup on 129. Tectonic mandibles, palpable gulls, highway silt, fetal cells, resin of a loathsome pine, these remains in the cellar my grandmother numbered. Westward, I tried it, my relation-splitting cedar planks, for the sauna is about my inheritance of base pairs toward the substance of some arrival. Walking, always this man I call Dostoevsky, walking his long coat and old shoes, walking, who is a man, who is beautiful, whose liver is diseased. A girlhood, a head of dandelion ozone, a camp called the Sublime where several minute species congregated the velvet stereopsis. Coyote was this young man in the convenience store, holding a piece of raw liver out to his friend? Or was this White Crow in Fort Francis after the hunt? I made love to a man, lost his rib in poison ivy. There was a collective juvenilia, and to be a woman was to be lost, so I hugged my ribs and laughed. Copper dissidents, or a fallow deer, so rabbit, speak with relevance here, and curtsy your superlative name, Agnosia. I slept in voices of smoke by the basement wood stove, in our house by the cemetery, to be small and dreaming parallel to ceremony and decay. I found the body of a fur trader in the hunt shack back there in those woods, where I guarded him like a treasure. Before I left Chapleau for the city, which vets me scientifically and by its shadows also, a false shore above the original. Dearest ones, please know, I'll do my best not to die young in Toronto. And I'll read one more, which is sort of a mirroring or companion piece to Think Tent. This is called North by South. Was as if I really knew, but then the dream changed. Stalactites under Mexico become the show ponies of our thrownness, gradually turning into an estuary of blood and soy. Blessed, unfettered, the open stones face. There are more totem moments where the stars have drunk the ocean. On a self-similar confessional flight path over the northern hemisphere, this account of light as an acquired characteristic became propositional, just as every forest would come to speak to us as a verb. Sweet citizen, I know you as I know myself, a fictive province of selves within Doppler range. Oh, body sensate, your telepathy so impatient. Soon you'll know hope is no nutrient, no last word on forgiveness. Opiate moment, unlatch the skull of a lake from your trophy of red snow. We're in this for the killing fields of every biome. Prosperity, a glittering dryad, felled on the horizon. If there are poems inside the camel, brush its hump with simple syrup. Ants come and eat the flesh away. Poetry evaporates from the wound your boots fill with milk. In the lecture theater, the poets stand with their camels. We had no words, our faces became indistinguishable. Is this an indigenous or occidental dream? Note the presence of wildlife and anxiety about money. We stand at the lectern of origin. We stand here not only to be counted. I felt I needed to walk far out into the woods, through the woods to a river, and walk upon the waters of that river dissolving. And the silt of me returns to Hudson's Bay, to the Arctic Ocean, is dispersed further into the Beaufort Sea I often dreamt of when small, napping beside a book of maps. In another dream, it's evening. I'm to photograph 3 women who face me with their babies bundled in their arms. Poet, scientist, and Anishinaabe smile at me, and one by one, the babies explode into flames. That same year, I sat looking out of the living room window at a boulder across the street, a glacial erratic split into 3 pieces by the growth of 2 birch trees. I remember when that stone was whole, my mother said behind me, "This is what life does." In a tradition not quite ablated by pox, TB, and/or Christ, the dreaming self, as corporeal in its endeavors as in a waking state, I go somewhere into a kind of felicity, unforgiving. Taking our birth names, we headed south, vaulting the tractionless sphagnum for a credit card. Our only limit will be of language. My carry-on could be your carry-on, only I am not a corpse, but a citizen. I tie a knot around the throat of all knowledge, insist I know where my own body was when the earth retired from intimacy. When presented with history in the form of an ellipsis, I must continue. Feral, I enter the court of words, December of my mind. Launch toward more than NORAD knows of the taiga. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. Okay, I just have a couple of quick questions. Really easy ones. Softballs. What's the relationship of your work to the truth? I can expand if you like. But I mean, Tanya, I'm thinking specifically of, obviously you're a journalist. You're working in a field where there are facts and there's a kind of epistemologically charged notion of what the truth is. And in Seven Fallen Feathers, you're also alongside these like painstaking chronological accounts of children's final hours. You're setting visions that there seems to be a tension there, or at least on the surface there would appear to be a tension between something like journalism and its like objectivity in quotation marks, and then visions and stories that you present in exactly the same way. So I wonder if you would like to talk about that.
Well, it's all true. To be honest, that's how I see things, and that's how I write. And in a book form, you could be that way. I can't really write like that for the Toronto Star. I mean, it'd get handed right back to me if I was to write my articles the way I wrote the book. I always saw what was happening in Thunder Bay is much deeper than just regular stories. I mean, and it always seemed to me that people just didn't understand the tradition, the Anishinaabe tradition that's up there, the culture. It always gets washed away, and there seems to be, for me, there's been always, I could always see almost like an undercurrent of racism that runs through Canadian society of just to kind of look away from these truths and these traditions. But if you do, you miss the whole story. And the story of the 7 is far more than just what happened to them, like a black and white story of this is what happened and this is may or may not be how they died or why they died. This is a story that's far greater than that. And I think that you have to put that culture, the Anishinaabe culture, in the book in order to understand the kids and the circumstances more, and the land and everything else.
Great, thank you. When you say, it's not a black and white story, your prologue does an amazing job of overlaying temporalities and territories and spaces in a way that really disrupts like the threadbare kind of notion of pre-contact and like post-contact and this, crater of contact in the middle of them. And I kind of wanted to ask about the first story in the prologue. It's just a couple of pages long, but Nana Bijou, the story of a giant that was watching over the Chippewa of the region, and they kind of had a deal. As long as the Chippewa didn't tell the white man where the silver was in the hills, Nana Bijou would continue to watch over them. And then the story doesn't, you think that's an easy setup. You kind of know what's coming next, but then it's quite complicated. There's a Sioux man who comes and lives among the Chippewa and overhears the secret, and then is captured by white men and, under duress, gives up the secret, but the consequence is still the same. Nana Bijou turns into stone and no longer looks after the Chippewa. Is that why you put that story first, to really complicate this notion of binaries, of there being a truth and a lie, of there being a black and white story?
That's a good question. That's only the second time someone's asked me that, so that's a good one. I think that the story of Nana Bijou, the sleeping giant, is integral to understanding the whole story of the book. You're right, it does set up a theme, a mood, a feeling that I see and I think is integral for the entire book. It's a story of betrayal, lost trust. It's a story of the protector that is asleep and is just stone. That really speaks to, in so many ways, what the Anishinaabe people are facing and overcoming on their own while the giant sleeps. And I thought that was important to sort of set that tone.
Thank you. And Liz, same question. What relationship does your work bear toward the truth? Nice and easy one, right? And I'll try to give some context. I'm thinking in terms of that so much in your collection seems to be like this crisis, and not necessarily a negative crisis, but a crisis about subject formation, especially under the pressures of objectifying forces like nationalism. And when you do in the book zoom out to these huge timescales, like the objectifying pressures of mutation and evolution. And so I'm wondering, in that schema where the subject is just in crisis, that is the state of subjecthood, a kind of crisis about itself, can truth even enter into that?
Can you hear me? Okay. I suppose when I was composing the poems in this book, my personal sort of crisis, that kind of emerges or evolved into the larger crisis of subject formation in the book, was that I've always struggled to find a way to express my experience in a way that I feel is deeply authentic and also compassionate, that also recognizes the absolute, agency and alterity, of the other, and the gulf in between two consciousnesses, whether it be yourself or your partner, yourself, friend, self, family, or author, and sort of what we would think of as a reader. It's such a difficult gulf to overcome, and the best way I found to do that was to communicate in this way, which is like an interplay between direct, utterance, speech, story, and a kind of disassembling of meaning, and a kind of chaos within language itself that sort of creates, a feeling of being off-center or whirling.
Yeah, you mentioned during the panel on Friday nights that you really value the capacity for poetry to hint at things without coming out and saying it.
Yes.
So for you, with this collection in particular, is the authenticity of the non-declarative, the kind of fuzziness, the smear of being, that's the focus rather than an issue of whether something is true.
Yeah, it's
and you
almost
can declare it.
like a concept in what is it, particle physics,
Right.
where like any sort of atom is just has this probability field of electrons around it, that any one position at any one given time is equiprobable to any other, and in a way that, insofar as our understanding of it, and my understanding of it is probably not even correct. Like I have like a, there's sort of a thing called like poet physics.
I'm right there with you. I was like, yeah, I know what you're talking about, but now I don't know if.
Yeah,
I
but
know what I'm
if there was a
talking
real like particle physicist here, I'm sure I'd get a good slap on the hand.
Anyone? We're good. Keep going.
But sort of I sort of think about it in that way.
Yeah.
And in not always being so direct and sort of guiding the reader or listener by the hand through something. I can convey more of like my experience by allowing their minds to have a varied experience of it, and having a variety of interpretations or experiences be possible and valid. And of course that means that I leave myself very much like open to failing the other, quite completely. I've been so fortunate that this book has gotten just like a phenomenal reception. But
Feeling any pressure about the second one?
yeah. But there has been, the odd person, because of, all these avenues online by which people can review your book. And of course, one looks at this in the middle of the night, and, there's some people who just absolutely loathed it, hated it, right? Because they didn't understand it. They felt excluded by some of the language. They felt they couldn't personally, emotionally connect with some of it. And of course, that's
It's
kind
very
of
challenging work.
Yeah. So.
Well, I made a joke about it, but I do want to ask what's coming down the pipeline. Are you taking like a well-deserved break from poetry? I'm assuming this collection's 2 years old-ish, that you're probably a little sick of touring it around. Are you focusing your energies on something else, or are you just like taking a break?
I'm trying to, but it's
People just keep calling you?
It's an embarrassment of riches, right? But I'm quite tapped. I'm exhausted. I also have a day job that whose demands are quite serious and rigorous, and living just in the increasing chaos of Toronto is also saps energy. And then I have this wild aspect to my life now that I never thought that I would have, which is like my poetry business life. Mm-hmm. Just going to different festivals, and people want you to, write little quotes, blurbs for their books. So you got to read their whole book 3 times. And people want little interviews, and just it all adds up. It adds up, like when you don't get home until like 7, and then you have to like figure out what you're going to eat, prepare it, eat it, and then what do you have, like an hour or 2 in the evening to sort of deal with personal business. And but I am working on I do have an idea, a loose plan for the second book and what I want it to look like, and I'm approaching it in a piecemeal sort of fashion. But
well, I'm glad to hear that.
But I'm hoping, I got a residency at the University of Calgary beginning in September of next year. So in that position, I'm able to devote 50% of my time to writing alone. So hopefully I'll be able to wrap up a manuscript in that time.
And Tanya, you're holding a fellowship right now. It's a year-long fellowship that allows you to focus on a particular current policy issue, right? It's a public policy issue.
Yeah.
And you started that fellowship just a couple of months ago. Is that true?
Just last month,
Just last month.
sort of.
So
Yeah.
are you allowed to reveal to us what you might be working on over this
Oh,
year-long
no.
fellowship?
No, I can tell you. It's
good.
yeah, it's on the suicide crisis of youth in our communities, and I'm looking specifically at. I'm starting with Northern Ontario, but I'm going throughout the country, looking for similarities and differences. And looking for, instead of doing stories that focus constantly on this is a tragedy that has happened here, and this is and focusing on solely on that, I'm hopefully looking at finding ways through the communities to help stop what's happening. It has to be community-driven, First Nations-driven. It cannot be driven from Ottawa or Health Canada. The plans have to be from the ground up. So I'm looking at doing stories on reconnecting with culture, reconnecting with the land, sexual abuse in the communities. All of these things needs to be, I believe, looked at when looking at the greater issue of incredibly high suicide rates in some of the communities when you're dealing with young children. And I'll also be looking at some other countries around the world that have Indigenous populations with the same issue. So I'll be doing that eventually once I stop going to festivals too. Yeah.
I can go in your place if you want. No one asked me to go to festivals. We are so over time. I blather on too much, but both of you will be signing books outside, right? So if there are any audience questions, save them for the lineup. Thank you both so much for coming here, for reading here.